Hello, my name is Dave Warren. I'm the Deputy Director of the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board. With me today is John Stanford, a Senior Advisor to the IPSASB. Welcome to the Measurement and Introduction to ED76 and ED77 webcast. This webcast will provide an overview of the key proposals in ED76 and ED77. You may also find helpful the at-a-glance summary of ED76 and ED77, which is available on the IPSASB website, www.ipsasb.org. John, why don't you kick us off and tell us what we're going to talk about today?
Thank you, Dave, and hello, everybody. Thank you for listening. We're going to start off with a little bit of background, highlight at quite a high level the key proposals in ED76 and ED77. Then we're going to talk about the measurement hierarchy, which is one of the main revisions, main proposals that we're making in both EDs. We'll be talking about current operational value, which is a public sector specific measurement basis under the current value model. And then we'll talk about the next steps, how you can further inform the development of these two EDs into final pronouncements. Okay, so back to you, Dave.
Thanks, John. So let me kick us off with the objectives of the measurement projects. And really starting the measurement project, you need to go back to when the conceptual framework was issued back in 2014. And you'll see by the end of this slide, we really come full circle, and you'll see that when I get to the end of this. But when we look at why the measurement project was started, coming out of 2014, the conceptual framework was issued, and the IPSASB was aware that there were still some areas of improvement where the IPSIS measurement principles could be better aligned with the conceptual framework. So a few years after the conceptual framework was issued, the measurement project was started with the stated objective of better aligning existing IPSIS with the measurement concepts in the conceptual framework. Now, the way that the IPSASB set out to achieve this objective was a four-pronged approach. And the first prong was to add guidance on the commonly used measurement bases in IPSIS and provide additional guidance on how these could be used. So you'll see as we go through the slides that we have identified four commonly used measurement bases. But what's really important is what ED77 measurement provides is significant guidance on how to apply each of these bases. As an example, we indicate which techniques are available. We talk about assumptions that should be applied. So at any point when you're applying an individual IPSIS and it indicates you need to measure an asset or liability using a specific measurement basis, you can turn to ED77 to receive more information on how you should actually measure that in practice. The second prong was to address transaction costs and borrowing costs. Transaction costs are addressed directly in ED77. We've provided additional guidance on when transaction costs should and shouldn't be included in the measurement of an asset or liability. And borrowing costs, while originally part of the measurement project, it was separated out with regards to the project coming out of responses to the measurement CP, because this was an area where the IPSASB thought they could progress that part of the project more quickly. And that is true because as we record this webcast, we're also going through responses to our borrowing costs ED77 as we speak. So that's something that's progressing and we're clarifying outside of the measurement project. The next prong is revising existing IPSIS and disclosure requirements as they relate to measurement based on the output of the measurement project. I won't get into the revision of IPSIS measurement principles in detail right here because we'll spend a lot of this webcast on that. But with regards to disclosure requirements, what's really important to note here is the IPSASB did develop additional disclosure requirements related to measurements where there were more assumptions applied in those measurements. So the further you moved away from observable data that was used in your measurements, the more disclosure requirements were included in the disclosure requirements in IPSIS. The other point to note here is the IPSASB has proposed that all of these measurement requirements are located in the individual IPSIS to which they apply. And the reason for this decision is that there was thinking that if you are measuring financial instruments or property, plant, and equipment, it would be easier to have the specific disclosure requirements related to measurement that were specific to those assets and liabilities in the standard you were actually applying. And then the final prong, and this is where we come full circle, is as the IPSASB was moving forward with this measurement project, they saw this as a good opportunity to better align it with the conceptual framework. So this is an area where the IPSASB decided to take a holistic approach and consider the principles that were being developed as part of the measurement project and consider how those worked with the concepts that existed and how the concepts in the conceptual framework needed to be updated.
Yes, thanks, Dave, for that summary of the objective of the related measurement projects. When it comes to the conceptual framework, there were really two catalysts. Dave's highlighted the fact that we looked at how the conceptual framework was influencing the development of standards level measurement requirements and guidance. The other catalyst for updating the conceptual framework is the fact that the ISB finalized its measurement chapter after the approval of the IPSASB framework. And we needed to look at some of the innovations that the ISB had made and consider whether they were worth looking at in a public sector context. Of course they were. So we reassessed some of our guidance in light of what the ISB's done. And in particular, we'll be talking a little bit later about the measurement hierarchy. The introduction, the proposal of the hierarchy in ED 76 and ED 77 is very much stimulated by the ISB's thinking. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, John. So let's move into the outputs of the measurement projects. I really like this slide because it really shows what the IPSASB is trying to accomplish by issuing ED 76 and ED 77 together and what the expected output of these projects is. So I'll stop here for a second. I'll let John take you through the conceptual framework, and then I'll take back over as we go through measurement.
Yes, thank you, Dave. The first thing to note is that we have retained the objective of measurement. This is an objective specific to measurement, separate from the broader objective of financial statements highlighted in the conceptual framework. So we've retained that objective. Some of the interesting innovations, one I've already alluded to, that we are proposing a measurement hierarchy, a three-tier hierarchy. That hierarchy will distinguish measurement models at its highest level, measurement bases, and measurement techniques. Now, the framework itself does not discuss in detail measurement techniques. It leaves that to ED 77. What the framework does is distill the existing guidance on measurement basis, and it proposes changes to the existing guidance on measurement bases. One of the things we've done is to look and see whether or not measurement bases are likely to be commonly used in the public sector. If they're not going to be commonly used, then we don't think there's a case for including them in the conceptual framework. We think that that rather clouds the discussion and is confusing. So we have reduced the number of measurement bases to those identified on this slide. Historical cost will remain an important measurement basis for both assets and liabilities. For assets which are primarily held for service delivery purposes, we have developed a new measurement basis, which we call current operational value. We've retained cost of fulfillment as the primary current value measurement basis for liabilities, and we have introduced fair value an exit-based fair value for both assets and liabilities. And I'll be saying a little bit more about the background to that later in this webcast. As usual, the views of the IPSASB and the reasons for the IPSASB's decisions are summarized in a basis for conclusions. Dave, do you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit more about the different components of proposed IPSAS measurement?
Thanks, John. So what the IPSASB envisioned with IPSAS measurement is what I'll call a one-stop shop. And linking from the concepts that are developed as to what John just spoke through in the conceptual framework, we've expanded on those in IPSAS measurement. And there are three key questions that we tried to answer. One was, what are the measurement bases? And we were identifying the commonly used measurement bases that are applied in IPSAS. The second, and this is probably the most important, is an appendix was written for each of those measurement bases, and how they are applied in practice is what the focus of these appendices is. So again, going back to something that I already mentioned, what techniques are available? What assumptions should be applied? What are the differences between each of these specific bases? And then finally, similar to the conceptual framework, a basis of conclusion was included that indicates why decisions were made by the IPSASB and decisions behind which measurement bases were included in this IPSAS measurement. Now, the next point to make is, I said IPSAS measurement was a one-stop shop. Now, how that links to other IPSAS is, other IPSAS will continue to indicate which measurement basis should be applied. So as an example, our property, plant, and equipment guidance or our financial instrument guidance continue to allow fair value as a measurement basis. However, when you're applying those IPSAS, any guidance that indicates what assumptions or how the measurement basis should be applied is now an IPSAS measurement.
You know, I found this distinction between what, how, why, and which particularly useful, because it is the case that we're not proposing that IPSAS measurement will specify which measurement basis should be applied in a specific standard dealing with specific assets, specific liabilities. That decision and the rationale for it will be provided in individual IPSAS.
Thanks, John. That's a really good clarification. So moving into this slide that is, we call it kind of our overall view of how the four measurement suite of EDs link together. John and I have spent the past slide focusing on the link between conceptual framework and measurement, so on the far left and the middle exposure drafts. But there's also a link to ED 78, property, plant, and equipment, and ED 79, non-current assets held for sale and discontinued operations. When each of these projects was operating individually, the IPSASB decided early on that it was important that the proposals that existed in each of the individual exposure drafts be exposed together so that constituents could consider the proposals holistically and respond holistically and see how everything fits together. We talked about the link between the conceptual framework and measurement, but on the property, plant, and equipment side, and I won't get into a lot of detail on this because there is a separate webcast on ED 78, the measurement project was proposing changes to property, plant, and equipment. We had a heritage project that was also proposing changes to property, plant, and equipment. And then there was also the infrastructure project. Again, the IPSASB saw this as an opportunity to make these changes or the proposals holistically and allow constituents to consider them as one with the other EDs. On ED 79, this was a project that was identified as part of the measurement project. And again, an opportunity for the IPSASB to propose changes as a group of EDs. This project focuses on alignment with an IFRS standard on non-current assets held for sale and discontinued operations, and fills a gap that currently exists in the IPSAS literature. In the case of ED 77, 78, and 79, there's a further link on the bottom right of that diagram that proposes changes to other IPSAS. So in totality, that's how this package of EDs fits together with each other and how it fits together more broadly with the existing suite of IPSIS. So as I move into the key proposals of the measurement project, there's 5 that I really wanted to cover. And the first one is initial measurement. And what initial measurement the proposals in ED 77 do is they really clarify existing guidance. And what these proposals propose is that on initial measurement, assets or liabilities should be measured at their transaction cost unless transaction cost is not available for various reasons. If transaction cost is not available, then assets and liabilities are initially measured at a deemed cost that will have to be determined by an entity. In some other instances, an IPSIS may override the initial measurement guidance and may have specific guidance on initial measurement. So the guidance in ED 77 is generic and can be superseded by a specific IPSIS. The second key proposal is subsequent measurement. And John has touched on this, and we have a slide coming up that really digs into it in detail. And subsequent measurement was really the focus of the ED 77 project. It was really clarifying the measurement basis that exist in IPSIS and how they're applied in practice. John touched on the measurement hierarchy, which is a clarification of the board's thinking on how measurement subsequent to initial recognition should work in practice. But again, the big focus is the adding of the how to apply these measurement bases in practice. The next change is fair value as a measurement basis. So this was proposed early and was included in the consultation paper. And what the board identified was fair value was used throughout the IPSIS literature. But we had multiple definitions. We were using older iterations of the definitions, and the IPSASB thought this was a good opportunity to align fair value consistently throughout the IPSIS. One of the steps early on was to determine what was meant by fair value. And a proposal that the IPSASB made in the consultation paper was in numerous circumstances, in the majority of the IPSIS that were aligned with IFRS, the intent was to use fair value as defined by the IASB, or in this case, the fair value definition in IFRS 13. This proposal was put forward in the consultation paper and was strongly supported by constituents. However, constituents did indicate that while they supported fair value being included in IPSIS, they did have some reservations about whether it could be applied in all circumstances in the public sector. I'll stop there and continue on that in a second, but I want John to jump in and see if he has any comments from a conceptual point of view on fair value.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Going back to 2014, when the conceptual framework was approved by the IPSASB, we didn't include fair value as one of the current value measurement bases. The reason for that is that as a result of IFRS 13, fair value was an explicitly exit-based measurement basis. And we felt that we should have a neutral measurement basis, which was both an entry and an exit measurement basis. So we described the measurement basis called market value, which to all intents and purposes was the pre-IFRS 13 definition of fair value and the definition of fair value, which was current in IPSASB's standards level literature at the time. Now, as a result of standard setting developments following the approval of the framework, the IPSASB reassessed that view. That was particularly due to the work which Dave's described going on in development of the measurement ED, but also the work that IPSASB did on financial instruments, updating its literature to take account of developments in the IASB's work program, in particular, the IASB's approval of IFRS 9. So the IPSASB came to a view that a current value measurement basis, which is explicitly exit-based, should be included in the suite of measurement bases in both conceptually and in the literature. And the proposals in ED 76 and ED 77 reflect that decision. The only other thing I'd add is that market value, whilst we are proposing that it be deleted from the conceptual framework, bears a lot of resemblance to the market approach as a measurement technique. So we are preserving some of the ethos behind market value in the measurement techniques proposed in ED 77. Okay, thanks, Dave.
Thanks, John. And that segues really well into the public sector specific measurement basis that we developed and proposed in the conceptual framework and ED 77. As I mentioned a minute ago, what we saw was there was significant support for the IFRS 13 definition of fair value being incorporated into IPSIS. And a good example of this was the one that John just touched on related to financial instruments. There was a decision made by the IPSASB that financial instruments were the same in the public sector as the private sector, and as a result, measurement in the private sector and public sector as it relates to fair value should be the same. And while constituents supported that, like I said, they did indicate that they didn't think fair value was appropriate in all cases. The IPSASB took this response, and what they did with it was they developed a public sector specific measurement basis that focused on assets that were held for their operational capacity. I'll get into this a little more in a couple slides where we dig into this in a little more detail, but it is important to know the background as to why they made this decision. The last point I want to make on key proposals, and I've touched on this a few times, is for each of the commonly used measurement bases that was identified in ED 77 and the conceptual framework, a separate appendix was developed for each of them in order to support preparers in applying the principles in practice. So again, what techniques are available, what assumptions should be made, what are the differences between each of the bases. So that moves us into something you've heard John and I talk about a few times, and that's the measurement hierarchy. So the measurement hierarchy, similar to the project more broadly, focuses on subsequent measurement. And as John indicated, this hierarchy has 3 tiers to it. The first tier relates to measurement models. And measurement models are approaches that are available to present assets and liabilities. And at a models level, there's really 2 approaches you can take. You can present your assets and liabilities at either the amount that you paid to acquire the asset or the amount you paid to incur the liability, which is the historical cost model, or you can update the value of your asset or liability for current values at each measurement date. Once we move past the models level, we move to the basis tier. And the basis tier represents approaches that are available that best represent the model that's being selected by the entity to present their assets and liabilities. So under the historical cost model, there's the historical cost basis. There's not really anything too interesting under the historical cost model. But as we move to the current value model, this is where we can really distinguish between, even though we're always measuring at current value, so we're always updating the value of our assets and liabilities, there's different perspectives on how we can do this. And I'll focus on the far left, which is current operational value versus fair value. Fair value is an exit measure, as John said. So this is a measure as to what the value of the asset or the liability is to a market participant, versus current operational value, which is an entity-specific value, which focuses on the value of an asset to the entity that holds that asset. So as an example, and one that was much discussed, was the value of a school in a major city center. And even though you could always update the value and you're always applying a current value model, depending on the measurement basis applied, current operational value or fair value, you could come up with different values. Under fair value, it's how much a market participant would pay to acquire that school and land and the entire package, versus current operational value, which is the value of the school and the land and the entire package to the entity, which may be very different values because a market participant may pay more or less depending on what the highest and best use of that asset is. The third tier is techniques, and techniques represent different ways that the measurement bases can be estimated depending on the information available. So the three techniques that are available are market approach, cost approach, and income approach. And I think in practice, the way these will be selected will really be dependent on the data that's available. So market approach will generally be applied when there is an active market for the asset or liability, and the entity can look to that market to determine the price of the asset or liability. In several cases in the public sector, an active market won't be available, so the cost approach or the income approach will be applied. The cost approach at a very high level is the cost that would be required to replace the asset, and the income approach is discounting future cash flows associated with that asset or liability. Again, depending on which technique you will use will be dependent on the information available as it relates to that specific asset or liability.
From at a conceptual level, one of the things to acknowledge is that there is both continuity and change in what the IPSASB is proposing. Certainly, we are proposing a modification of the measurement bases that are described in the framework. However, there is continuity to the extent that the IPSASB is not seeking to identify a single measurement model. It's not seeking to identify a single measurement basis or a combination of measurement bases for all circumstances. So the IPSASB is retaining the mixed model approach, which characterized the 2014 conceptual framework.
Thanks, John. So I'll take us into our last item that we wanted to cover from an ED 77 and ED 76 point of view, and that's current operational value. So as I indicated, there was strong support for including fair value or the IFRS 13 definition of fair value in IPSAS. Like I said, there was also caution that fair value as defined in IFRS 13 may not be applicable in all circumstances. The IPSASB looked into this further, and what we realized is that where the challenge in applying fair value in the public sector generally relates to assets that are held for their operational capacity. So those assets that are held to deliver services. And this goes back to the example I just discussed, where there might be a school that's held in a major city center. So the value of that under fair value might be different than the value that the public sector entity sees it, where it's not held for sale, it's held for its operational capacity. And this is what the IPSASB really focused on when they were developing current operational value. Those assets that are held for their service delivery objectives, and how we could more fairly reflect the value of those in the financial statements of the holder of those assets. While there's a few differences between fair value and current operational value, the one that really summarizes it is the last point on the slide, and that's you're measuring assets using a current operational value based on their current use. So if I was going back to my school example, you would measure the school based on how the building is currently being used, not alternative uses, whereas fair value would require that you measure the asset at its highest and best use. This may or may not drive a difference in value, but this is a key aspect of current operational value. John, did you want to add anything from a conceptual point of view?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Current operational value is one of the main proposals in both ED 76 and ED 77. From a conceptual perspective, current operational value has some similarities to both replacement cost, which was one of the measurement bases which was defined and described in the 2014 conceptual framework, and which we're now proposing is deleted. And also current cost, which is one of the current value measurement bases in the ISB's conceptual framework. However, its real distinguishing feature is the fact that it focuses on the value of an asset to achieve the entity's service delivery objectives at the measurement date. And this really emphasizes the public sector specific nature of current operational value. And as Dave says, distinguishes it from fair value. So in the suite of measurement bases that we're proposing in ED 76 and ED 77, we have current value measurement bases which are appropriate both for service delivery purposes and where an entity is holding an asset with a view to trading or disposal.
Thanks, John. So let me move into the last section, and that's really the next steps and how listeners can respond to these proposals. So in both ED 76 and 77, we do include a number of specific matters for comment. Please respond to all of them. Please respond to those that are of most interest to you. Either way, your responses are great value and a significant asset to the board in developing the final standards. We've included the SMCs to the conceptual framework, or ED 76, in ED 77, so they can be read as a package and read holistically. The comment deadline for all the EDs that we discussed in this presentation is October 25th, 2021. We provided a 6-month exposure period because we do realize this is a larger package and we wanted to give constituents the opportunity to consider them all holistically. Should you want to respond, please submit a comment on the IPSASB website. It can be found in the consultations tab at the top of the page, and then there's a submit a comment link that can be clicked on. And then if you'd like to be better informed, or you'd like to stay informed on these projects, I've listed the 2 websites on this slide. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone who invested their time today to learn about the measurement suite of projects. I hope you found this webcast informative and a helpful first step in submitting a response. Thank you and have a great day.